Hello to everybody here today. Uh, we are the Animal Law Center at Nalsar was set up in 2016 as the nation's first research and policy center devoted specifically to the issue of animal protection laws. In light of the recent coronavirus pandemic that is thought to have originated from a wildlife wet market in Wuhan, China, we felt it would be extremely pertinent to discuss the issue of wildlife trade and the issues of zoonotic disease transmission. Zoonotic diseases are diseases that originate from animals. And in the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity's executive chairperson, Elizabeth Mrendu, has also spoken about how it's extremely important in the current climate to institute a ban on wildlife trafficking in order to curb this menace. The World Wildlife Federation has also spoken about certain environmental factors that continue to drive zoonotic diseases and make it increasingly necessary for people to take immediate action. This has also been highlighted by Traffic India, which has highlighted the fact that in India, poaching and wildlife trafficking has continued to increase in scope despite the ongoing lockdown and despite the risks of disease transmission becoming increasingly clear. In order to help us spread light on these topics, we have two extremely distinguished speakers. We have with us Mridula Vijay Raghavan from WCS India, who is their legal director with a specific focus on wildlife law. She's been actively involved in wildlife litigation in the National Green Tribunal and other courts, and she focuses extensively on development projects that affect protected areas and environmental impact assessments. Also with us, we have Sumant, a nature, education and wildlife expert who is currently the campaign manager for wildlife at Humane Society International India. He has served as a faculty for various judicial academies, including the NJA, and has trained officers from the police and forest departments of various states. He is the lead of HSI's activities on human-wildlife conflict management and illegal trade, among other areas. I'd now invite Sumant to get us started on this.
Thank you so much, Abhijit, for that. Thank you to Nalsar and the Animal Law Center for having us here. I must apologize in advance for not turning on my video because I'm in a poor bandwidth area. And I guess this has become the new norm now. Thanks to the topic that we're going to speak about, which is wildlife trade and zoonotic disease transmission. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the next 10 to 15 minutes maybe to quickly introduce the problem of zoonotic disease transmission and also look at what we do or how we've contributed to it and what we could do to prevent another one in the future. All right, can we go to the next slide? Thanks. So let's go right back to basics of understanding a virus and what a virus is. Virus, as are infectious agents. There are millions of species of viruses, and a virus is nothing but genetic material in a coating of protein or lipid. And the sole purpose is to replicate in living cells of other organisms, and eventually also mutate and recombine with other reagents. Next slide. Right. A lot of the content that I'm going to be speaking about today is going to be pertinent to the current pandemic we are in, because that just gives you more context to it. Every time we do speak about zoonotic disease transmission, unfortunately, wildlife is vilified as being the source of it. And while we know that all animals, including humans, we are a petri dish for pathogens, for various kinds of pathogens. And zoonotic disease transmission goes both ways, and we seem to forget that. There's a very real chance that whenever animals and humans interact, the more and more animals and humans interact, the more and more chances there are for zoonotic disease transmission. Unfortunately, in the current case, in the case of COVID-19, bats have been vilified for this as the main cause for this pandemic, which is not true. Bats are a natural host for many, many viruses. And one of the reasons they are so is because they are long-lived animals. They can fly, so they travel far. And the virus, being an organism, being a biotic organism, it's in the virus's best interest to latch on to something that can fly far and wide, so it can spread itself, which is the nature of a virus. And of course, bats all over the world carry coronaviruses. This is not new. It's not unheard of. Next slide. Right. What we seem to forget is that bats are ecologically extremely important. They are pollinators, they are seed dispersers, and they play a vital role in insect control. What we need to do is start demonizing bats. If you remember, this also happened when the whole Nipah virus outbreak happened in Kerala a few years ago, where there were colonies of bats that were vilified and killed. What we often seem to forget is that bats traditionally are symbols of good luck and happiness in most cultures. There are over 1,400 species of bats around the world, and more than half of them have population trends that are either declining or completely unknown. Unfortunately, the suggestion that the COVID-19 virus may have originated in bats is putting them at increased risk. What's really happened is that as COVID-19 has spread, people in China and other parts of the world have started requesting that hibernating bats be expelled. And hibernating bats being expelled causes abnormal arousal patterns, which could lead to a high bat mortality and potentially to the spread of other viruses. The captured bats, there are also instances where bats are being captured from different places to be released into the wild, which is not their native habitat and poses a further threat to their survival. These decisions are not based in facts. These decisions are not based in science. COVID-19 was linked to horseshoe bats, which do not hibernate in cities in China. But the reputation that bats carry as virus carriers has led to the suggestion that there needs to be mass slaughter or mass extinction of bats. The exaggeration of bats' negative traits, what we tend to forget is that the regard for positive ones, which could ultimately lead to their needless and intentional elimination. What we'd like to do now is take you through a quick video on where a zoonotic disease of this nature might have originated. Next slide, Hemant.
Just been provided inadequate air, and by the time they get to a market, they're in such terrible condition. These kind of markets occur around the world, so it could happen at any time in any one of these markets. That's why we need all countries to take measures now to prevent the next outbreak from occurring. We really need to close the markets, stop wildlife transport, and encourage people to stop eating wildlife. Stop the wildlife trade. That's the answer.
And can we move on to the next slide? Right. So the problem here is that often there is one species that is the source of some virus. There are intermediary species, and then of course it comes to humans. As hard as it to believe, wildlife trade is not the primary cause for pandemics such as this one. The primary cause is large-scale deforestation. What deforestation or fragmentation of habitat does is it brings wildlife and people closer and closer to each other, thereby increasing the amount of interaction and increasing the chances for jump of pathogens from one species to another. There are, we've all been hearing about these wet markets in China where this virus originated, but wet markets are not new. And wet markets are a source for virus, as we have always known. There are several wet markets in India as well. Wuhan, for instance, in China, had about 57 species of animals, of which 2/3 were wildlife, and again, like it says, 1/3 were domestic and farmed animals. As you can see in the image, all of them are stacked in close proximity to each other, which encourages a mix of bodily fluids. That's essentially a breeding ground for pathogens. And all of these animals are under terrible stress. They tend to shed more viruses. To give you a brief idea on statistics of this, between the years 1940 and 2004, with about 60% of the diseases that came about around the world were caused by zoonotic pathogens. Of these 60%, 72% were caused by pathogens of wildlife origin. The risk of transmission is not just in in the place of capture or in the place of breeding of these animals. It's across the entire supply chain, right from the time of capture, across all the transport hubs, up to the final destination. Next slide, Heyman. So all these pandemics, any wildlife market, any animal market really, is a ticking time bomb. It creates an environment, like we said, that encourages pathogens to jump species barriers, and there are several species that are reservoirs and hosts for so many of these pathogens. It's just a disaster waiting to happen. As a response to the current pandemic, next slide, the Humane Society International, we released a white paper called Wildlife Markets in COVID-19. We did this in about 11 papers globally. We also do have it in English, and we're going to get it in a few regional Indian languages as well for anybody's reading. But what this does is this white paper looks further into details of the origin of pandemics such as this one, and proposes sustainable solutions for this. Next slide, Heyman. Thanks. So if you're looking at disease transmission potential in India, what we do need to realize that these wet markets, these animal markets, are not restricted to China. It might be so much more visible in China because we see so many more images and videos coming out of there. It's a reality. It's a day-to-day reality in India, and it's not restricted to wildlife markets alone. This is a risk waiting to happen in any animal market. There are hundreds of species, as we speak, being taken away from their natural habitat in India to be brought into trade. Star tortoises are in trade everywhere. Parakeets are caught by the hundreds for trade. Owls, you name it, there are species being caught and consumed for various purposes. What's also happening is that with the population, with the human population of India growing as it is, we are increasingly pushing into wilderness areas, and that brings us closer and closer with wild animals, which is again a huge risk for pathogens to jump species barrier. In these wildlife markets, like I'm not sure if you've been to one before, but if you go into Bombay and go to a Crawford market, for example, you'll see species from multiple geographies in one place. And when I say multiple geographies, it is not even restricted to India anymore. You'll see Indian species along with exotic species. There are markets in Bangalore that sell serval cats, which is an African species, alongside pigeons, alongside chickens that are also slaughtered for meat and sold there. These animal markets, these wildlife markets, are really what we need to focus and where we need to focus our legislative efforts on. Next slide, Heyman. Like I said, animal markets are very, very common all across India. These are just a handful of them. There are so many more. It's going to take up a few dozen slides if we start listing all of them. But these are the most popular ones, and there are many, many more. Pidia Bazaar in Delhi, you could literally walk in and walk out with any bird, any endemic or exotic bird that you'd like. Mir Shikar Toli in Bihar is again a very, very notorious wildlife market. I've seen civets for sale, pangolins for sale, leopard cubs for sale in Mir Shikar Toli, out in the open. It's not even hidden anymore. And this is all in a line of shops which is also selling meat for consumption, as well as these endemic and exotic wildlife. What I'm going to do next is just take you through some of the images of animals that we've rescued from trade, all of which have been from similar markets. Next slide, Heyman. These, as you know, are parakeets, roasting parakeets, and Alexandrian parakeets, young from the wild, literally in dozens, if not 100, and they're sold for as little as 400 to 500 rupees each. They're transported across the country. The majority of the sale in these parakeets comes from Tamil Nadu and Kerala, and you can find them being shipped in buses all the way across the country to Delhi, to Bombay, to even parts of the northeast. Next slide. What you see in this slide is, of course, more rescued Alexandrian parakeets on the right-hand side and African hedgehogs on the left. And again, these were rescued from the same store. The store also was an aquarium selling fishes and fish food and whatnot, but all of it again under one roof. Next slide. Right. I'm not sure how many of you have heard of a very infamous wildlife market in India. It's supposed to be India's oldest cattle fair called Poor Mela that happens in Bihar once a year. I'm not sure what's the plan for this year, but it usually happens in the month of December. And Poor Mela is one of a kind. I've been there year on year for several years now. You could walk into Poor Mela and walk out with anything from a plastic mug to literally an elephant in hand. You name it, it's sold in the Mela. Dogs, monkeys, snakes, crocodiles, elephants, all of it in the Mela is being sold. We did a very extensive a petition against this in Bihar High Court and got a ban on it as recently as 2 years ago. But up until then, we have about 5 or 6 years worth of data on all the wild animals that are being sold there. Unfortunately, at this point, the ban only applies to wild animals. The domestic animals are still sold like in the image you see. Next one. Right. This image is again another one from Poor Mela of a young rhesus macaque being sold. Poor Mela has become a conduit for a lot of these wildlife specimens that are coming in from northeast Indian states, come to Sonpur and then go further along. When I was at Poor Mela a few years ago, I think about 5 years ago now, I was shown an elephant calf that was about 3.5, 4 feet in height. And they said for 5.5 lakh rupees, they would deliver the elephant calf anywhere in India. That's literally how open and brazen the trade is. And we can expect nothing else but disease transmission in these fairs and melas, where there's also lakhs and lakhs of people thronging to see these animals day in and day out. Next slide. Right. If you can look at what do we do to prevent another one in the future, the one thing that we actively advocate, and I think Mridula might speak more on this, is for all of us to start working with our district administration or the state administration to ensure there is no sale of wildlife illegally and in the pet shops, as all endemic wildlife are protected under the Wildlife Protection Act, and there is relatively severe punishment for violating sections of this act. The one thing that has unfortunately become a trend of late is purchase of exotic wild animal species. Like I said, there are people in Bangalore who have kangaroos, wallabies, serval cats, and whatnot. These do not belong here. Forget about belonging in India. These do not belong in homes. Serval cats, if you see images of them, are fairly large African cats that can jump up to 10-12 feet high in air to catch a bird mid-flight. Those animals do not belong in apartments that are 1,200 square feet or even slightly bigger than that. They shouldn't be here. So please discourage people from buying exotic animals and fueling the trade further. The one thing we actively ask of all citizens is to not encourage live animal markets or to strictly regulate live animal markets if there is one. Crawford Market in Bombay has just got such a notorious reputation of being in place for so many years now and selling everything under the sun, right from exotic species to endemic species of protected wildlife. You could walk in and walk out with tortoises, turtles, and whatnot. And yet, there is little to no action taken on the traders there. What we also do and ask of people is to work with, again, your local administration to ensure that all the pet shops in the region are registered with the government agencies under the Pet Shop Rules of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act, so they can at least be regulated and monitored in terms of what they sell and how they're selling these. Same thing with meat for consumption. Only buy meat of those species that are prescribed by FSSAI and bought only from the FSSAI or authorized outlets. Illegal meat shops, like we've spoken so far, have the highest chance of being breeding grounds for pathogens. This I hope provides a brief background on this. Next slide, Hemant. Right. That's about it for me. I'm happy to hand over back to Abhijit.
Thank you very much for that informative session, Suman. I'd now like to invite Vidula to share her thoughts and experience in this.
Thanks, Abhijit. I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, give me a second. There we go. Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to this. Firstly for organizing this and talking about something of such great importance. So thank you very much, Abhijit, for extending this invitation to me. I thought Sumant covered and did a fantastic job of introducing the problem and went over the crux of the issue really. So I'll very quickly slide over some slides that talk about similar things and then jump into existing legal frameworks, but really in a nutshell, and then talk about some policy changes that we should consider to reduce risk of zoonosis or like zoonotic diseases in the future. So wildlife trafficking actually is amongst the top 4 global smuggling crimes, and it is valued at approximately $23 billion US dollars annually. So it's an extremely lucrative, low risk, high profit crime, which often doesn't get the attention that it deserves. You hear of seizures and narcotics, and often a lot of attention is also paid to human trafficking. But unfortunately, we need to start addressing and being more vocal about wildlife trafficking as well. Wildlife trafficking and trade is not necessarily a new phenomenon. It has been around historically. There have been instances of Persian traders gifting lions to Maharajas in Gujarat. But what is really of concern is the scale and the magnitude of the trade as it is today. This is an image of a seizure of 5 tons of pangolin, that were concealed under frozen fish in a shipping container in Indonesia. And as a lot of you may know, pangolins are amongst the most illegally traded species in the world, and their populations are dwindling rather rapidly. A lot of you may have heard of The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling, which was written in 1892. And when Kipling wrote The Jungle Book, there were about 1 lakh tigers in India, and today we're about 3,000, at about 3,000 tigers. And these are only some of the species that are in the trade. And India particularly is a mega diverse nation. We have all of the species that are rampant in the trade. We have rhinos, we have elephants for their ivory, we have pangolins, we have tigers, we have leopards, we have freshwater turtles and tortoises. So we also have plants that are very much in the trade. So it's an important issue for us as a country as well. Now, why is it important to address wildlife trafficking? Sure, zoonotic diseases is a major problem, and we'll dig into that deeper. But also, extinction of species is something that we've already seen. The black rhino has gone extinct in Africa as a victim of the trade. In India, tigers went locally extinct in Sariska because they were hunted out for the trade. There's also been evidence in Northeast India that trade of rhino horns often funds militant and insurgent outfits. And this, of course, is a great concern, and it is not just about wildlife trafficking, it's also a national security risk. And of course, human disease from the illegal trade in wildlife is not new. And the current pandemic is, I think, is really a stark example of what the trade can really do. Sumant has gone over much of this, but very, very briefly, this is not the first disease outbreak. In 2002, we had SARS, which originated in mass farm civets. There was the avian influenza in 2003, which originated in mountain hawk eagles. We had monkeypox in 2003, again, which was a result of African rodents being transported to the US for the pet trade. And we had Ebola, which also likely originated in bats and in primates. So this is not new. This is something we've known for a while. In fact, researchers from One Health have been warning people for over a decade that there has been an increase in virus spills from illegal wildlife trafficking, and unfortunately, we've not paid heed to it and have landed ourselves in a pandemic. Yeah. So again, Sumant has gone over this, so I'm not going to spend much time here. But these animals are transported in extremely unhygienic conditions. They're extremely stressed, so the viral load is really high. They're species that should not, under natural circumstances, be together, that are forced to be together, like Sumant described. And this is of great concern. And also, like he said, if you think that it's just some wet market in Wuhan, and it's not our problem really, that is not true, because all major metro cities have markets in which wildlife is sold quite openly. In fact, there was, I think last year, a seizure in Hyderabad of jackals and vultures from Murgi Chowk in Hyderabad. So this again is not new. But I will jump now into existing legal frameworks, and there's two things I think it's important to make note of. One is zoonosis is not dependent on whether the trade is legal or illegal. A zoonotic disease can very well originate also from legal trade, and across the world at the moment, trade is regulated, and so there is a very good chance that a zoonotic disease may emerge from trade that is very much legal. So I think that's important to keep at the back of your mind as we go through the next few slides. And another thing is, I think when we talk about legal frameworks in India, it's important to take a step back and view wildlife conservation holistically and look at how India's laws are structured, and how it has the potential to already reduce chances of zoonotic disease in the country. So India has an extremely strong Wildlife Protection Act. It is considered amongst the strongest in the world. It prohibits hunting of any wild animals that are listed in the schedules of the Wildlife Act. And hunting is given a very broad definition. It includes naming, capturing, or actually killing, or even attempting to hunt an animal. We have a prohibition on illegal possession of any wild animals, and this, I think, is one of the more powerful provisions of the Wildlife Act, because there is a reversal in the burden of proof in the event that someone is charged with illegal possession of a scheduled species. What that means is that if I'm caught in possession of, let's say, pangolin scales, it is it is my job to then prove to court that I was in fact not in possession of the pandemic case. As against, traditionally, it is for the prosecution to prove the crime. So, this is also very interestingly a provision observed in other very strong legislations like the NDPS Act, the Narcotics, Drugs and Psychotropic Substances Act. There is also a ban on trade of species. And here, actually, if you look at the provisions of the Wildlife Act, they are really regulatory in nature. They say with permission from the Chief Wildlife Warden, you can trade in XYZ species, or you can transport species, or you can be in possession of these species. But in practice and in the way in which the Wildlife Act has been implemented, such permits are rarely issued, except in really exceptional circumstances, such as when it is for research or it is for scientific studies. And we also have a really strong provisions that grant protection to protected areas and prevent illegal entry and illegal taking of wildlife from these protected areas. And it's important to remember, like Sumant said, that it is not just about the trade in wildlife. This issue finds its root in deforestation. So the Wildlife Act has strong provisions for conservation of protected areas. Another thing to keep in mind is that we are a country that is often a source country for the trade, and therefore wildlife from our forests is going out of the country to Southeast Asian countries, to European countries, to the States, etc. And so to have a strong protected area network is very positive. Now, the Wildlife Act that we saw just now essentially deals with wildlife trade within the country, domestically. But when it comes to cross-border trade, India's foreign trade policy for 2015 to 20 prescribes what trade is restricted and what trade is prohibited. And India implements the provisions of the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna through this foreign trade policy. Now, what is CITES? So CITES is an international convention that has been around for about 45 years now, that has been entered into by about 183 countries. And the purpose of CITES is really to regulate the trade in wild animals to ensure that we do not decimate wild populations of these species across the world. And CITES has 3 appendices with varying degrees of protection and varying degrees of requirements for international trade in these species. This convention is implemented in India through the Customs Act of 1962. And so it is customs officers at ports of entry and exit that implement CITES. Another thing to remember here is that CITES is the floor. It is a regulatory mechanism, right? It's the floor, it is not the ceiling. And it is not a CITES mandate. Zoonotic diseases are not a CITES mandate. In fact, early on when the pandemic first broke out, the CITES website had a disclaimer that said matters of zoonotic disease are beyond the purview of the CITES mandate, and therefore we cannot comment on whether animals caused this pandemic or not. So this is another key thing to remember when we go forward and talk about deficiencies in existing policy. So like I said before, export and import of all animals protected under India's Wildlife Protection Act are prohibited. There are, of course, exceptions. Often these are for exchanges with zoos abroad, etc. And export and import of animals that are not protected under the Wildlife Act, but are under either CITES or the foreign trade policy, are restricted. And depending on the appendix in which the species is found, there is a bunch of paperwork that goes in to actually export or import these species. Additionally, the chief wildlife warden of the state from which the animal is being either exported or imported grants something called a legal procurement certificate. So we have a regulatory mechanism for export and import of these species in essence. So now having, I couldn't go into much detail, but just to touch upon some of the deficiencies in domestic law that we need to address to curb the wildlife trade, and which in turn will reduce instances of zoonotic disease, are quite a few. And so I think that the Wildlife Act, while it is a very, very strong legislation, also suffers from some deficiencies, I would say. So, for instance, the schedules of the Wildlife Act are not very well drafted and not very logically put together. You'll find that species that are rampantly in the trade, like the tokay geckos or the star tortoise, are Schedule 4 species, which means that they are granted lower protection under the law than, say, a leopard or a pangolin, which is a Schedule 1 species. And given that these species are so rampantly traded, it's important that they be put in the right schedule. So and this is just one example of many that I'm citing. So if you just kind of skim through the schedules of the Wildlife Act, you'll see that it suffers from quite a few issues. And also it has not been updated in a really long time, and so there are incorrect names, etc., scientific names, etc., which gets in the way of prosecution of these cases. Another thing is the punishments under the Wildlife Act, in my opinion, are a bit haphazard. I won't say they're inadequate, and this, of course, is a personal opinion, but I do think that they are a little skewed in that the hunter so wildlife crime is an organized crime. You have someone taking the animals out of the forest, and then there's a trader, and then another transporter, and then there's finally a financier who's kind of this puppeteer who manages this whole syndicate. And the Wildlife Act actually punishes the hunter with the same punishment as that financier. And that, I think, is deeply problematic because it takes away from the gravity of organized syndicates engaging in wildlife trafficking. So this is something that I think our domestic law needs to address. Finally, marine species need to be treated completely differently than from terrestrial fauna, and the Wildlife Act fails to really acknowledge that, but I won't jump into details of this one. Another concern has been that the Animal Quarantine and Certification Service, essentially when animals are imported into the country or exported from the country, they are quarantined and tested to make sure they are not a risk and are not going to, are not carrying disease with them. Now, what is alarming is that as recently as in July this year, while we were battling this pandemic, there has been an exclusion of certain wild animals from needing testing under AQCS. And this is concerning because while there has been adequate evidence to show that COVID probably originated from bats, to then exclude wild animals from requiring quarantine is a bit worrisome. So these, I think, are broadly issues that we need to change in existing policy to have a better chance of reducing, zoonotic disease. But also, sure, we have really strong laws, but unless we implement them, we're not going to see change. And there are quite a few reasons why there is a really poor implementation of the Wildlife Act. One, of course, is inadequately trained ground staff. So, if you ever interact with frontline forest department staff, they're incredibly hardworking, and like really the safety of our forests is in their hands. But they're overwhelmed with responsibilities, and they have multifarious responsibilities and cannot focus on tackling the wildlife crime. And therefore, this is something that needs to be addressed on an urgent basis. So the legal team at WCS India is also conducting a study to see why there is a very poor rate of conviction in wildlife cases. And one of the reasons that emerged was that judges and prosecutors are often unaware of special provisions of the Wildlife Act. And it's unsurprising if you think about it. A judge deals with about like over 100 statutes every day while they're dealing with cases, and expecting them to have specific knowledge of the Wildlife Act may be unfair, and therefore express sessions talking about the Wildlife Act and its provisions and bringing to their knowledge the dangers of this trade is very important. There's also the issue that wildlife crime is not an issue that can be tackled by the Ministry of Forest and Environment and Forest or the forest departments alone. It's an organized crime where you need so many agencies to work together to really clamp down on this crime. There have been instances of Customs Department and the Forest Department coming together to prosecute cases successfully. And there's been instances of paramilitary forces, particularly in the Northeast, like the SSB and the BSF and Assam Rifles, who seize wildlife and then hand them over to the Forest Department. But it is still inadequate, and we need to motivate other agencies to work with forest departments to prosecute wildlife traffickers. Finally, India is amongst one of the few countries in the world that recognizes illegal trade in wildlife as a predicate offense under our money laundering law. And we've had this provision for about 18 years now, and in 18 years have had only one conviction of a wildlife trafficker under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act. And this, I think, is quite worrisome, because when we have the provisions, we must use them to the best of our ability to clamp down on traffickers. So this, again, is something that we need to understand why it's not happening and then make it happen going forward. Now, I just wanted to quickly go over, while in India we have strong domestic laws, wildlife trafficking is a global issue, and we have animals being trafficked from several countries across the world, and so the effect of zoonotic diseases is something that we need to address, as a global issue and not in our own silos. As of date, there is still no concrete plan on how we are going to do this going forward. But I just wanted to put some ideas that experts have had out there, and it's just food for thought, really. One opinion is that CITES should be amended, or there should be an addendum to CITES for what is called reverse listing of species, wherein trade in the species is disallowed until it is proven that this species is not a high-risk species for zoonotic diseases. There has been a lot of debate about this, and an amendment to CITES is something that experts are rather, careful about doing, because it opens up a can of worms and can, going forward, open the floodgates for more amendments and undermine the existing interpretation and enforcement of CITES, of CITES as it stands today. And so another option is to add an addendum to the convention that specifically addresses zoonotic diseases and perhaps adopts reverse listing of species to reduce risk of zoonotic disease transmission. But at the same time, I must remind you that CITES has been around for 45 years and has never addressed the issues of zoonotic diseases as a consequence of wildlife trade. Its mandate has only been to regulate the trade in wildlife to make sure that wildlife populations are not decimated. Another school of thought is that the World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and the World Organization for Animal Health must come together and collaborate to prevent further zoonotic diseases and work with governments to do this. And there's no real structure for how this would happen, but this is another idea. And finally, another school of thought is that there must be a multilateral One Health agreement, and One Health is essentially takes the view that we must create an optimal environment for people, for animals, and the environment, and collaborate with countries across the globe to achieve this end. So another possibility to reduce zoonotic disease transmission in the future, or even to conceive more coronaviruses, is to have such a multilateral One Health agreement. But at the end of the day, it is about motivation from these different governments, and it is about taking this issue seriously. And over years, several years, we have finally come to a point where we have in environmental jurisprudence, we recognize theories like sustainable development or the precautionary principle, and it's about time we treat zoonoses as, and like prevention of zoonoses as a third leg really of how we view international environmental law. So just to end, I think a lot of the audience is trained in the law, and WCS works with law enforcement agencies to improve implementation of existing laws and to help law enforcement agencies prosecute and convict wildlife traffickers. And we're a small legal team, and we could really use help from others that are trained in the law. So if you're interested, you can feel free to write to us at cwp@wcsindia.org. We're also happy to work with you if you are in law school. You can still help out with this burning issue. So yeah, thank you very much.
Talk, it was very informative, and I'm sure everybody here agrees. I think anybody else has sent in any questions or anything. So if there's nothing else, I would like to thank our speakers once again for that extremely informative session. Thank you so much for spending. I'm very happy to have had your insights on these issues, and I think everybody can agree with me when I say we've all definitely learned a lot from this. Thank you, and we hope to be able to work with you again soon.
Thank you so much, Abhijit, for organizing.